So hello to everybody who just joined, and hello to everybody who's watching this in the future as well. I feel like I'm in 2 time zones right now. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited to continue our new Macmillan Teaching Topics webinar series with this discussion about incorporating case studies into your course. My name is Will Moore, and I work as part of the Life Sciences product team here at Macmillan Learning. So we're so happy to have the chance to engage the STEM community with this series of teaching webinars. So thank you all for taking the time to join us today. Our speaker today is Michele Shuster. She's a professor of biology at New Mexico State University. She focuses on the scholarship of teaching and learning, teaches introductory biology, microbiology, and cancer biology classes at the undergraduate level. And she also works on some K-12 science education programs. She's also the author of one of our textbooks for the non-majors biology market. That's called Biology for a Changing World. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Just want to add some logistical details. Because we have a large audience for these, voice communications are muted by default. We want this to be interactive. We want to make sure we answer any questions you may have. So I'd encourage you to submit those questions or comments through the question function and the sidebar controls of GoToWebinar. I'll be monitoring these throughout the presentation, and when we have time to break for questions toward the end, I'll address them to Michele, and she can address those for you. So I'm thrilled to pass it along to our speakers. So with that, we'll let you go ahead and get started.
All right, so thanks everyone for coming. I know Will mentioned it feels like he's in several time zones, and the same here because I'm in Mountain Time, and I know some of you are Eastern and some of you will be in the future, but hopefully we are all feeling perky after our extra hour of sleep that we all got this weekend with the time change. All right, so with that, I'm going to get rolling. And so again, I'm delighted to share with you some of my ideas about case studies in science teaching. Some of you may already be familiar with using case studies, and some of you may not, but hopefully there'll be something for everyone as we go through this today. And so if you're not as familiar, you may be thinking, well, what are case studies? And really, I just think of them as stories. So as humans, we are storytellers by nature. We love stories, and so this is a really great way to communicate science to students. And so for case studies teaching in science, our stories tend to be more scientific stories. And as Kip Herod would say, they are stories with an educational message. So these are intentional stories, not tangential stories. And they're stories that we hope will help our students meet our course learning goals, particularly ability to apply the information, analyze information, and also help increase the interest and motivation of our students. So another way to think about case studies is that they're a form of active learning. And so we all know active learning is when the students are really doing the work. And that doesn't mean that we've put it all on them and left them to flail and hope that they're going to figure things out. But as instructors, we have facilitated the learning. So we have set up a learning environment in which students can work on developing their skills, practicing their understanding of the material, and we are giving them that opportunity to actually do something, and we are not just lecturing at them. So, okay, guilty, I am just talking at you, I apologize. All right, and we do know that active learning is a good thing, particularly from Scott Freeman's meta-analysis of 225 studies that compared traditional lecturing to active learning. And that was published in PNAS, and what he found is that with active learning, the exam scores were approximately half a letter grade higher compared to courses that relied on traditional lecturing. And the failure rates were lower, and these are course failure rates, were lower in courses that relied on active learning versus traditional lecturing. So it was approximately 21% course failure rates with active learning versus 34% for traditional lecturing. So it seems like active learning is a good thing. It helps students do better in our courses. And so I guess the next question is, so why this particular form of active learning? Why cases, why stories? And so a lot of it is because the content becomes contextualized. And so I always think of a case as having some kind of a hook. And that is what brings students into your story. And so this helps motivate student learning. It enhances their interest and their engagement. And that in turn contributes to persistence. And for all of us in STEM, we know that persistence is a huge issue that we need to continue to work on with our students. Another reason to consider using case studies in your teaching is that when you do them well, they do require critical thinking of our students, and that's something that we all value is critical thinking. And they're very easy to be set up to allow students to work collaboratively, so they really foster collaborative learning, and that is very much an inclusive teaching practice, and that's also very important for persistence in STEM. So I don't want to spend a lot of time going over all the evidence about case studies, but I do wanted to give you just a few highlights about what we know about teaching with cases. And so this is based on publications where they're maybe based on faculty surveys, student surveys, some analysis of student performance. And so one thing we know is that faculty enjoy teaching with cases. I know I do. We also know that faculty report that students think critically, are active participants, and learn more when they are exposed to case studies versus more traditional forms of learning. We know that the scores on at least analytical exam questions appear to be better when students are taught with the case method than the lecture method. And this is particularly from a paper looking at an upper division sort of plant pathology course where they had to analyze particular plant crop failures. And when they had been taught with a case, they did much better than when they were taught with a traditional lecture. And this is also consistent with what we know about problem-based learning. And so in many ways, case-based learning and problem-based learning have a lot of overlap. And so we're not necessarily surprised that students do better on sort of analytical type questions. And then finally, when students are asked, which did you prefer in your course, students generally report preferring cases over lecture. So it seems like there's a pretty solid case for teaching with cases. So the next question we can think about is, well, okay, so what can I do with cases? How can cases help me help my students meet the learning goals for this course? And so I would say the answer to this is like, gosh, anything, infinite answers. So I've just picked a few things that I thought might be interesting for us to think about. So one thing you can do with cases is, depending on how you set it up, is you can use them to humanize scientists. So you can make scientists more relatable to students. That's a good thing. But you can also allow your students to see themselves as a future scientist. You can show them scientists who look like them, and maybe that's going to help them realize, my gosh, I could be a scientist. That person looks like me, had similar life experiences to me. And so if we include actual scientists in our case studies, we can provide some role models, perhaps some inspiration for students to persist in science because they can visualize themselves as a scientist. And so I just wanted to give you a few examples that I've come across. So this is a screenshot from a New Scientist article, and it's a screenshot that's featuring the Jeffrey Bean Rock Stars of Science campaign. And so this was done a little while ago, and as you can see, there's photographs of rock stars. So this is Sheryl Crow, and then the rock stars of science. So in this case, I'm sure we all recognize Dr. Fauci. He's been in the news a lot lately. And this is Harold Varmus, who is a Nobel Prize winner and former director of the National Institutes of Health and the National Cancer Institute. And so you can see it's like, here's these two scientists with Sheryl Crow. They can't possibly be nerdy guys, right? So it's a way to sort of humanize them. Other venues where you could get ideas for Humanizing Scientists are the Story Collider. And again, here's a screenshot from their homepage. And so these are basically podcasts with sometimes scientists, sometimes not so scientific people, but all sort of having some kind of life experience that they share. And so students hear about these, you know, sometimes wacky life experiences. They'll be like, oh, well, if that person could overcome that, you know, then so can I. I can be a scientist too. So this is, and these are really interesting podcasts. I've listened to several of them. Kimberly Tanner and Jeff Shinsky have the Scientist Spotlights Initiative. And again, here's a screenshot from their homepage. And basically, these are features of what they refer to as countertypical scientists. So as we know, many students think of scientists as older white gentlemen. And so as you can see, here are all kinds of scientists who may actually look more like some of our students. And so this is a way to integrate the science with a scientist who may more closely resemble many of our students. So there are lots of ways to think about integrating the scientist into your case study story to help inspire our students to persist in their chosen field of study. All right, what else can we do with cases? We can explore life-saving discoveries. And so I just have a few examples to share with you. So for example, you can use a case study to talk about new diagnostic tests. And so for example, Buffalo Case Studies, the National Center for Case Study Teaching and Science, which I'll tell you about in a moment, sort of had a call for case studies related to the COVID pandemic during the summer. And so some of those new case studies are sort of using a story-based approach to describe how some of these new diagnostic tests are working. You might use a case study to sort of talk about the genetic basis for a disease. So for example, if you wanted to talk about cystic fibrosis as an example of autosomal recessive inheritance, you could basically do what I just did, or you could introduce, for example, Emily Schaller, who has cystic fibrosis and has far outlived the lifespan that would have been predicted for her given when she was born, based on all of the research and discoveries that have gone into cystic fibrosis treatment. So you could sort of use this person, so you could use Emily as your hook to then get into the genetics of cystic fibrosis or the targeted therapy or the cell biology of cystic fibrosis. You could talk about new drugs, new treatments. So for example, I developed a case study for my first case study this fall where we always do like the scientific method. And so the case study was basically asking students to figure out, is hydroxychloroquine effective, whatever that means, in the treatment of COVID? And so my hook was just a whole bunch of headlines. I went onto, news sources and I got screenshots of headlines that basically, highlighted the controversy over hydroxychloroquine. And then I sort of had them walk through a couple studies, and at the end of the day, they were able to draw their own conclusions. In this case, that there was no convincing evidence that hydroxychloroquine was effective for much of anything related to COVID. I'm also teaching my cancer class this semester, so we talk a lot about new cancer treatments. And so the hook is often a patient where I can, reconstruct a patient from, for example, a published case study of an actual clinical case in the New England Journal of Medicine. So we can have an actual patient, or maybe it's a patient who's posted on a cancer blog publicly. And so that's my hook, is this person who has this type of cancer and has had this kind of treatment failure. And now there's this new drug, and how do we predict this drug to work, and a kinase inhibitor, blah, blah, blah. So you can kind of move into the science after having this sort of compelling hook, this reason to bring your students into your science. And so there's, lots of ways you could go with this. You could use cases to investigate scientific or medical mysteries. Who doesn't love a mystery story? Me. Okay, so for example, I have one where I use the case. I can use it to teach scientific method. I can also use it to introduce the concept of cell signaling. But for example, did the elephant man have Proteus syndrome? And so my hook for that one is a picture of the elephant man, and then a description of his life. And it's like, people have wondered, they thought he might have had neurofibromatosis, maybe he has and then we basically go through this case study to try and figure out how would we determine whether or not he had Proteus syndrome. Another case study I've developed is, what I really want them to learn from it is protein localization within a cell, like why do proteins go to where they're supposed to go to? But the story is about a family who has a kidney disease that turns out to be the result of a failure to move a protein to where it's supposed to go. And so the hook is sort of the family tree, showing this disease in this family and then describing some of the symptoms that they experience. But ultimately, I'm going to teach them about protein localization, but they're really interested now because of this hook, right? This story of this family. You can also use cases to generate scientific explanations. So for example, why does smoke inhalation kill you? And so I might want to ask that question, because then I can look at hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide and how they interfere with cellular respiration for different ways. So it's a way to reinforce their understanding of cellular respiration. But the hook I use are photographs of sort of the remains of nightclubs that have had, horrible fires, horrendous fires have broken out. And I think most students expect that those deaths that occurred are going to be due to burn injuries or trample injuries as people try to get out of the building. But in fact, unfortunately, the vast majority of the deaths are because of smoke inhalation. And so like, well, why? What's going on with that? And then we can have this whole conversation that gets us back into cellular respiration. I do a similar thing, again, related to cellular respiration, where we might want to look at different metabolic poisons and predict how they're going to interfere with cellular respiration. So one of those is DNP. And there's lots of newspaper articles that I can give my students a link and they go read about, you know, a young woman was trying to lose weight. She ordered these black market pills over the internet. They were DNP, and she basically cooked to death is how, you know, the British tabloids express it. And then we get into this case study in class and we're like, okay, well, what happened? Why did her body temperature go up? What's going on here? And that sort of, again, asks them to analyze what's happening and demonstrate their understanding of cellular respiration. So I feel like in many ways, it's all about the hook. All right, so now hopefully you're all super excited. If you're not already teaching with cases, you're ready to start. And so the question is, where do I find these cases? And so it turns out there's a lot of venues where you can find cases. So this is one I mentioned before. It's the National Center for Case Study Teaching in Science. It's hosted by the University of Buffalo. And so for a long time, everyone's called it Buffalo Case Studies. But there are peer-reviewed case studies. And so everything in this National Center for Case Study Teaching in Science, the case studies are all peer-reviewed. So they have to go through a peer review process before being published. And they have all kinds of disciplines. So yesterday I just did a quick scan, so I'm reading, and I could find cases with aerospace, civil engineering, biology, food science, mechanical engineering, physics. So it's not just biologists. And you can also look, sort of search by, they call it topical area. And so that might be, I would like to look at cases on the scientific method. I would like to look at cases on policy issues or social issues. So there's a variety of ways that the cases can be searched so that you can find one. They also have by level, so high school, lower division, undergrad, upper division, undergrad, and even some graduate cases. Right, so you can go in and search and you can find all kinds of interesting cases like, ooh, look at this one. Just happened to come across this one. Okay, I know, I'm biased. All right, so here's one of mine. This is actually the kidney disease case I was telling you about. So it's protein targeting gone awry, and so you could find that. You can download the case, and if you have a membership, you can download the teaching notes and an answer key. But the case is free for you to use, is my understanding. So that's Buffalo Case Studies, the National Center for Case Study Teaching in Science. There's also HHMI Course Source, and again, this is peer-reviewed and evidence-based teaching resources for, in this case, the focus of Course Source really is undergraduate biology education. But again, you can search, there's articles, there's case studies, there's activities, so there's a variety of resources in Course Source, but including case studies that you could implement in your classroom if you're a biologist. Also from HHMI is HHMI BioInteractive. And so this, again, is primarily biological, but there are all kinds of different classroom resources. And so there are actually resources, for example, you can assign a video, so the students could watch a video first and then come to class, and you would go through some sort of a case study related to what they learned in the video. So there's all kinds of resources at HHMI BioInteractive. Some of them are just like a single figure, like a map with data, and you can turn just that single map into an entire case study. What is this showing? What do you predict? What would happen if? So you can sort of use that map as your hook, and then the story of whatever data is being shown in that sort of graphical representation. So lots and lots of resources at HHMI BioInteractive. And then there's also Merlot, not the wine, unfortunately. But anyway, so Merlot has all kinds of resources for teaching, and you can browse, and there is a wide range of STEM disciplines represented in Merlot. So, and again, you can search for a variety of teaching materials, and they do have case studies as a particular search term. So you can search for case study, you can search for your discipline, and see what is in Merlot. And if you want to be bonkers and write your own or adapt, there's all kinds of ideas out there. So I get most of my ideas from listening to National Public Radio in the mornings or the New York Times. or my subscription to New England Journal of Medicine. So for example, on NPR one morning, I was brushing my teeth, and they were interviewing a woman who was going to take the 23andMe breast cancer test. And then how she was going to interpret the data almost made me spit out my toothbrush. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so not right. I have to write a case study for my student. And so I have them go to that article because that's on the NPR website, so they can go listen to that report or read the transcript. And then they basically work through some sort of questions, and the case becomes understanding the strengths and the limitations of that particular test. I can use it to teach the difference between inherited and sporadic breast cancer, all kinds of things. So the hook is I send them and go listen to this article, and then they're all like, wow, where are we going with this? So lots of hooks you can get just from sort of often your day-to-day living. There is an article where a biochemistry professor would get ideas for case studies from TV shows like medical dramas. Of course, that article, gosh, I want to say it's from like 2009 now, I forget exactly, but you know, they mentioned House and ER. I'm like, okay, we're going to have to like update to at least Grey's Anatomy, right? Because our kids haven't heard of House anymore. But you could, you know, use episodes. You could show clips, for example, or you could talk about an episode and the symptoms. And then she was able to use that to get into like biochemical pathways, for example. Current events can be motivators for case studies. And also people suggest that historical events could also be hooks for case studies. Although I've seen a couple cautionary notes when I've been reading where more recent events may be more engaging to our students than real historical events. I leave it up to you to decide. You know your students like better than I know your students. So with that, I know that was a little fast, but I'm happy to take any questions or comments. I'm happy to, I don't know, blather on some more. Let me know. Where would you like to go from here? Will.
All right, send in your requests for blathering on further through the question panel, right? All right, a few questions. Thank you, by the way. This was great. How did you get started with this? I mean, is this something you've been doing since you first got in the classroom, or did you kind of go through a transition at some point?
So I definitely went through a transition. My first experience in the classroom was at University of Pittsburgh. I'd been hired as a non-tenure track lecturer, and I was teaching a lecture in a classroom that sat 425 students, and there were 425 people in the seats. And I was doing my best, but I had pretty wordy, at that time it was those overhead transparencies, and my students were like, this is a lot. And I'm like, okay, I need to find a way to make it interesting. So then I would try and have examples to at least go beyond like a boring recitation of facts. And then I sort of kept moving in that direction. We moved down to New Mexico State, where I was also just started off as a non-tenure stream faculty member. So I had 100% teaching, large lecture halls. Although luckily at the time, our largest lecture hall only sat 300. And I'm like, what can I do with these people, these students, to make this interesting? And so I was trying to come up with examples and modify things. And finally, I had the opportunity to do a week-long summer workshop up at Buffalo. And I believe they still run it, maybe not COVID years, but it's a week-long workshop. You go up there and you write a case study, by golly, and then they actually cough up undergrads at the end of the week, and you can practice run your case study on those undergrads. So then that's when I really started trying to write my own and use my own, and just found it made a remarkable difference in my teaching, in my students' attitude, in my attitude. It was like, this is just so much more interesting. Like, there's a purpose here. We are going to get to the bottom of this story. So yeah, I learned it, but I have been doing it for a long time now. That was like 2006 when I went out to do that workshop. It was a while ago.
Cool. All right, how do you keep students from looking up the answers online?
So normally when I do case studies, because I'm a face-to-face teacher, I teach in one of those active learning teal style classrooms. And so when we're all in the classroom together and they are sort of struggling to get through the material, they're sitting at these round tables, right, that seat 9 students each. So they already have 8 other students they can ask, and they can brainstorm. I'm lucky I have peer facilitators, and so they can run around to the tables and sort of ask the probing questions. If people are really lost, we all come back together. And so what I found in the Teal classroom, no one was Googling anything because we were just working it out together. Like they could figure it out and we were there to help them. Like that's the whole facilitation. It doesn't mean I just kick back and be like, okay, go, it'll all be fine, right? No, I mean, it's active facilitation and you're kind of needing to nudge them or what if or what that, and they're drawing stuff on the walls. And so it never occurred to me that they would Google stuff because they never did. Like they were able to figure it out for themselves. Now that we're online, this has become like a huge issue for me because I'm like, well, why would they look it up? They can figure it out. They got big brains. But I'm doing all my classes asynchronously this semester. So I don't have any synchronous sessions to facilitate them. And so what I'm finding, I'm having to make many modifications to my case studies this semester. The first modification, and this I kind of don't, it drives me bonkers because the whole point of the case study is supposed to be authentic, right? But I have had to anonymize any drugs because otherwise they just go look it up and type me stuff about penicillin. I'm like, that wasn't really what I was. So I have this one case study where it's an outbreak of fungal meningitis, and it actually happened from the New England Compounding Pharmacy where they contaminated injectable steroids with fungus, and then all these people got, it was like the largest outbreak. They all went to jail. It was horrific. And so what I'm trying to teach students is why is it so hard to treat a fungal infection? And it's because fungi have eukaryotic cells like we do. They don't have prokaryotic cells like bacterial cells, so we have fewer points of difference, right, for the treatment. And so in class, they're told about different drugs like antimicrobials, antifungals, antivirals, and then they have to figure out what's going to work and why. And none of them are Googling anything, right? They're just thinking. But what I found is when I transferred that online in the spring, I'm getting all this nonsense about like stuff that they've clearly just Googled, and it's not really responsive to the question I'm trying to ask. So I've learned this semester what I need to do is like drug A does this, drug B does that, so that they're just thinking about the information they have. And then once it's closed and I've graded it, then I tell them, okay, these are actual drugs. Like this is penicillin, this is chloramphenicol, this is, you know, whatever. And so I have had online to anonymize my drugs. I've also had to write in a lot more supports into like the handout. I usually will also do like a little screencast that sort of walks them through the handout. And then what I've also found helpful in the online asynchronous environment that I'm in right now is their handout, they're still answering open-ended questions. So they're getting that opportunity to try and connect the dots, put things together. But then what I do is when they go to make their actual submission, instead of just uploading that Word document with their open-ended responses, I basically create a quiz in our LMS. We use Canvas. And so the quiz, what I do is like if there was an open-ended question that says, what do you predict is going to happen? Or how would you describe, you know, this spindle treated with this drug? They had to write something on that handout, but when they get into the quiz, I've turned it into more of a closed-ended question. So it's a multiple choice or a multiple drop down or a matching kind of thing. I feel like since I started doing that about 4 weeks ago, they're doing better on the quiz part, but I think it's because they might have not been quite, you know, on the proper, exact, accurate trajectory with that open-ended writing. But then when they're confronted with the closed-ended options, I think that helps consolidate. They're like, oh, okay, now I kind of see what it is. So I'm okay with them doing that Word document and struggling and maybe not being quite on topic, but thinking hard. And then when they go into the quiz, giving them some more discrete options to help focus them on, okay, I get it exactly now what we're looking at. So I feel like that's been some of my compromises, especially in the online environment. If you, whoever asked the question, if that didn't exactly answer it, type some more stuff for Will to tell me to do.
Well, that was perfect because this segued into, we had several questions come in after that about tips for using case studies online or in remote learning, best practices. So I think that's what you just hit on right there.
Lots more scaffolding, lots more. And don't give stuff that they can Google.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think these teaching in this method needs to be handled differently for a general ed type of class versus a majors level course?
I use case studies in both my non-majors and my majors intro courses. For the non-majors, I still use the cases because it really gets them interested. I mean, they're non-majors for a reason. Like, they are scared of science, and that's why they're not a science major. And I do not want to make them more scared. I want to make them interested. So for them, the case studies, obviously I need them to learn some content, right? But they're really about science is interesting and you can figure this out. It's really confidence building, and then applying it to something that's relevant to their lives. Like, oh, I had no idea about this. And so it might be about a dietary thing, right? Or a reproductive thing. And so I shift the emphasis so it's more on real relevancy to your life in the non-majors. In the majors, sometimes my case study, sometimes the story is really working through a scientific study, right? And they're going to interpret a graph, or they're going to interpret some data, or they're going to draw a graph and make an interpretation. And so that's really enforcing some of these science skills that we really need for our majors. And I could see that would completely turn off a non-major. But for a major, I'm like, I think they still, a lot of them still find that interesting, especially if it's a study that involved, you know, humans or a disease. I can still do all of that reinforcement of the scientific method, of data analysis. The version of intro that I teach for majors is the cell and molecular. So I have lots of pre-nursing students, lots of biology and biochem majors. So I do not have the agronomy, the horticulture, the sort of ecology flavor of the intro course. I have the, you know, the one that lends itself nicely to sort of medical studies and medical data, and that seems to appeal to my students. So I would say I use them both, but I do sort of tailor what my goal is in each course.
All right. Do you think there are any downsides or pitfalls of this approach that that instructors should be aware of?
So I think, like, as I've been learning and using these a lot, I think it's really important to have very clear, like, learning objectives. And so I tend to write learning objectives for each case study, but I write them as questions on the first slide, like, here's the questions that we're going to be answering today. And that allows me to be sure of what I want to do with the case, right? So it helps me focus my attention. What else? I personally tend to use case studies generally, not 100%, but generally we will have learned some content. So we'll have some sort of, well, in the face-to-face classroom, we'll have some sort of interactive lecture, we'll have clickers, we'll have think, pair, shares, we'll have brainstorms. So we'll kind of gotten the content and did some basic practice. And then the case study generally is an application of that content to something, right? A disease, a process, whatever. So for me, I tend to use case studies as reinforcers. Sometimes I'll use a case study as a way of introducing a new topic. Like, I have another case study I've published in Buffalo is about leptin deficiency. So there's a photograph of this enormously obese 2.5-year-old, just enormous, and they have a problem with leptin, blah, blah, blah. And I use that to set up the idea. So what's the problem? There can either be a problem with the hormone or with the receptor, and then there has to be some signal. So I sort of use that to frame the idea of cellular communication, like a signal molecule, a receptor, and then some kind of transduction and response. I think it works okay, but I can also use it. It also has a lot of, like, data, like they have graphs and stuff, right? So it serves dual purposes. For me, I find it harder to use a case to teach content de novo. For me, I find that cases work well to reinforce content that we've sort of talked about in a prior lecture, generally. That's me.
Makes sense. All right. That is the sum of the questions that have come in. So
All right.
I think with that, we will go ahead and wrap up. So I just wanted to say thank you, Michele, for this presentation today. This was really great. Thank you for all those who attended live. We were thrilled to have you guys here. And to all those who are watching this in the future, thanks for your attention as well. So
Thanks, everyone.
Go ahead and wrap up. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks.